I still remember the taste of that bitter coffee from the office vending machine at 2 in the morning. It was December, and the heating system in our small accounting firm had been acting up for weeks. I sat there in my cubicle, surrounded by scattered papers and empty energy drink cans, working on what my boss called the project that could change everything for us. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like some kind of mechanical lullaby, and I felt this strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. This was my chance, I told myself. This was the moment when all those years of staying late, covering for colleagues, and accepting extra responsibilities would finally pay off. The project was massive, a complete overhaul of our client management system that could potentially save the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. I had been handpicked for this assignment, and the trust felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. Little did I know that trust would soon become my greatest weakness. The project had started 3 months earlier during a Monday morning meeting in our cramped conference room that smelled like stale donuts and cheap coffee. Our regional manager, Janet, had flown in from the corporate office in Chicago, and she laid out the challenge with the kind of enthusiasm that made everyone sit up straighter. We needed to streamline our processes, eliminate redundancies, and create a system that could handle our growing client base without requiring additional staff. The room fell silent for a moment, and I could feel the weight of the challenge settling on everyone's shoulders. Then Janet's eyes landed on me, and she smiled that knowing smile that made me feel chosen. "Sarah, I think you're the perfect person to lead this initiative," she said. "Your attention to detail and your understanding of our current systems make you irreplaceable for this project." The word irreplaceable echoed in my mind like a promise. I accepted the challenge without hesitation, my heart racing with anticipation. But as I would learn, being irreplaceable during the work phase doesn't guarantee being remembered during the recognition phase. Those first few weeks were like a whirlwind of discovery and planning. I spent countless hours in the office basement, going through old filing systems and interviewing long-term employees about processes that had never been properly documented. The custodian, an elderly man named Frank, who had been with the company for 23 years, became my unofficial guide through the maze of corporate history. He would bring me coffee around midnight and share stories about how things used to be done. "You know," he told me one evening as we sat in the break room, "I've seen a lot of people come and go here. But you're different. You actually care about getting things right." His words meant more to me than any formal recognition could have. I was building something important, something that would outlast my time at the company. The spreadsheets I created grew more complex each day, mapping out workflows and identifying bottlenecks that had been slowing us down for years. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering the hidden secrets of our organization, and every discovery brought me closer to what I believed would be my moment of triumph. The turning point came when I realized I couldn't handle everything alone. The project had grown beyond my initial estimates, and I needed help with the technical implementation. That's when David entered the picture. David was the kind of colleague everyone liked, charming, articulate, and always ready with a joke to lighten the mood. He had joined the company 6 months earlier, and had quickly established himself as someone who could talk to anyone about anything. When I approached him about collaborating on the project, he seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity. "This sounds like exactly the kind of challenge I was hoping for," he said, leaning back in his chair with that easy confidence that made conversations feel effortless. We shook hands on it, and I felt a surge of relief. Finally, I had a partner who could help me bring this vision to life. David's technical skills complemented my analytical approach perfectly, and within weeks, we had developed a rhythm that felt almost effortless. He would handle the software integration while I focused on the process design and documentation. But as the project progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in our dynamic. David started referring to certain elements as our ideas, even when they had originated from my research. During team meetings, he would present concepts I had developed as if they were collaborative efforts from the beginning. At first, I attributed this to his enthusiasm and team-oriented mindset. After all, Wasn't collaboration supposed to blur the lines of individual contribution? I convinced myself that this was how successful partnerships worked. Ego took a backseat to results. When colleagues would compliment specific innovations in our system, David would smile and say, "We really think this approach will revolutionize how we handle client data." The word "we" felt inclusive at first, but gradually, I began to sense that it was slowly erasing my individual contributions. Still, I pushed these concerns aside, focusing on the bigger picture. The project was succeeding, and that's what mattered most. Or so I thought. The final month before the presentation was when everything accelerated beyond my control. David suggested that he should be the one to present our findings to the board, arguing that his communication skills would serve the project better. "You know, I have experience with executive presentations," he said, during one of our late-night planning sessions. "I can really sell this thing in a way that gets everyone excited." His argument made sense on the surface. David was naturally charismatic and had a way of making complex concepts sound accessible. Meanwhile, I had always been more comfortable behind the scenes, doing the detailed work that made everything possible. When I hesitated, he added, "Don't worry, I'll make sure everyone knows how crucial your contributions have been. This is about the project's success, not personal glory." Those words should have been a red flag, but I was too tired and too invested in the project's success to see the manipulation clearly. I agreed to let him take the lead on the presentation, believing that our partnership was built on mutual respect and shared goals. The night before the presentation, I sat in my apartment reviewing the final slides one more time. The project represented 4 months of my life, nights, weekends, and holidays spent building something I truly believed in. Every chart, every process map, every recommendation had been carefully crafted based on extensive research and analysis. As I looked at the presentation, I felt a strange mixture of pride and emptiness. Pride in what we had accomplished, but emptiness at the thought of watching someone else receive credit for work that had consumed my life. I tried to push these feelings aside, reminding myself that the project's success was what really mattered. But deep down, I knew I was already starting to lose something I could never get back. The trust I had placed in David, the belief that loyalty and hard work would naturally lead to recognition, was already beginning to crack. I just didn't want to admit it to myself yet. Tomorrow would change everything, and I was walking into it with my eyes wide shut. The boardroom felt different that morning. I arrived early, as I always did, and found myself staring at the polished oak table where my professional fate would be decided. The smell of fresh coffee and glazed donuts filled the air, but my stomach was too twisted with anticipation to handle food. I had barely slept the night before, running through every detail of our presentation in my mind. This was supposed to be my moment, the culmination of months of exhaustive work that would finally prove my value to the company. I chose my outfit carefully that morning, a navy blue blazer that made me feel confident and professional. As I sat in the second row, watching the executives file in with their notepads and serious expressions, I felt my heart beating so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Janet smiled at me from across the room, giving me a thumbs up that I interpreted as recognition of my hard work. The irony of that moment still haunts me. I thought I was about to be celebrated, but I was actually about to be erased. David entered the room with the kind of confidence that seemed to make the air itself more electric. He wore a crisp white shirt and a tie that perfectly complemented his suit, and he carried himself with the poise of someone who belonged at the front of the room. As he connected his laptop to the projector, I noticed how naturally he commanded attention. Even his casual small talk with the executives seemed effortless, punctuated by the kind of laughter that builds rapport instantly. I watched from my seat, feeling a complex mixture of pride and nervousness. This was our project, our months of collaborative effort, about to be unveiled to the people who could change both our careers. When he began the presentation, his voice was clear and authoritative. "Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to share the results of our comprehensive system analysis and the revolutionary changes we're proposing." The word "our" felt reassuring at first, a sign that he remembered our partnership. But as the presentation continued, I began to notice something unsettling about his choice of pronouns and the way he was framing our work. About 10 minutes into the presentation, David reached the section about our research methodology. This was the part one had spent weeks perfecting, interviewing employees, and analyzing decades of inefficient processes. As he explained the approach, he said, "I want to give special thanks to Jennifer from HR, who provided invaluable insights into our current staffing challenges." Jennifer had indeed been helpful, but her contribution consisted of 2 brief meetings and some basic employee satisfaction surveys. My heart started racing, but I told myself there was still time for him to acknowledge my role. Then he continued, "And I'm grateful to Mike from IT, who helped us understand the technical limitations of our current system." Mike had answered maybe 5 questions about server capacity over email. I felt a cold sensation spreading through my chest as I realized what was happening. David was systematically acknowledging minor contributors, while glossing over the person who had architected the entire project. The executives were taking notes, nodding approvingly, and I could see they were impressed by what they perceived as his inclusive leadership style. The moment that shattered my world came during the section on cost-benefit analysis. This was my specialty, the area where I had spent countless hours building models and projections that demonstrated the project's potential impact. David clicked to a slide that showed our projected savings of $340,000 annually, and the room fell silent with the kind of impressed silence that precedes career-changing recognition. "These numbers represent a conservative estimate," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Based on my analysis of our current inefficiencies and the projected improvements from our new system, my analysis, my sleepless nights, my interviews with Frank the custodian and dozens of other employees, my spreadsheets and my calculations and my discoveries." But in that moment, sitting in the second row of that boardroom, I became a ghost. The work existed, but I had been airbrushed out of the story, like a disgraced politician in an old Soviet photograph. I wanted to stand up, to interrupt, to reclaim my contribution, but something held me back. Maybe it was professionalism, maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the paralyzing realization that doing so would make me look petty and self-serving. When the presentation ended, the applause felt like mockery. The executives stood up, shaking David's hand, and patting him on the back with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for genuine achievement. Janet approached him first, her eyes bright with approval. "David, this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need more of in this company," she said. "Your leadership on this project has been exemplary." I sat there, frozen, as she continued, "And Sarah, you should be proud to have been part of such a successful initiative. Part of, not the architect, not the driving force, but simply a part of someone else's success story." The words felt like a slap across my face, delivered with a smile that made it impossible to respond appropriately. I managed to nod and smile back, but inside I was screaming. How had I gone from being the irreplaceable leader of this project to being merely a supporting player in David's triumph? The transformation had happened so gradually, so skillfully, that I hadn't even realized I was being written out of my own story. The worst part came during the informal reception that followed. As people mingled around the coffee station, I overheard conversations that revealed just how completely David had claimed ownership of our work. "David's really got a bright future here," one executive said to another. "The way he approached this project shows real strategic thinking." Another colleague mentioned how impressed they were with David's presentation skills and his ability to manage complex projects. I stood there with my lukewarm coffee, invisible among my own colleagues, listening to them praise work that had consumed my life for months. When David walked past me, he didn't even make eye contact. There was no acknowledgement, no subtle nod of recognition, nothing to indicate that we had been partners in this endeavor. It was as if I had been a temporary contractor whose services were no longer needed, someone who could be dismissed now that the real work was done. The casual cruelty of his indifference was perhaps more painful than outright hostility would have been. As the meeting dispersed and people returned to their regular duties, I found myself alone in the empty boardroom. The projector was still humming, casting David's final slide onto the white screen, a slide that summarized his recommendations for implementation. I stared at those bullet points, every one of which had originated from my research and analysis, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about credit or recognition anymore. This was about the realization that I had been played, manipulated, and discarded with surgical precision. David hadn't just stolen my work. He had stolen my narrative, my professional identity, and my faith in the basic fairness of collaborative effort. As I walked back to my cubicle, I passed his desk and saw him already on a phone call, probably with another executive, basking in the afterglow of his stolen success. The friendly partnership we had built over months had been revealed as an elaborate con game, and I had been the perfect mark, trusting, hard-working, and naive enough to believe that good work would speak for itself. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a strange mixture of hope and dread churning in my stomach. I had spent the entire night replaying the presentation, trying to convince myself that David's omission had been an oversight, a case of nerves that made him forget to properly acknowledge my contributions. Maybe he would approach me first thing, I thought, with that sheepish smile people wear when they realize they've made a mistake. Maybe he would suggest we go to Janet together to set the record straight. I even practiced what I would say when he apologized, something gracious and understanding that would preserve our working relationship while ensuring my contributions were recognized. But as I sat at my desk, watching the morning routine unfold around me, David walked past my cubicle 3 times without so much as a glance in my direction. Each time, I felt a little piece of my optimism die. By lunch, I realized that no apology was coming. This hadn't been an accident or a moment of forgetfulness. This had been a calculated decision, and David was perfectly comfortable living with the consequences. The afternoon brought an even more disturbing revelation. I was in the break room, mechanically stirring sugar into my coffee, when I overheard David talking to 2 colleagues from the marketing department. "Yeah, the presentation went really well," he was saying, his voice carrying that casual confidence that had once seemed so appealing. "I've been working on that project for months, and it's incredible to see it finally come together. Working on it. Not we've been working on it, or the team has been working on it. Just, I've been working on it." The casual rewriting of history was so brazen that I almost dropped my coffee mug. I stood there, frozen behind the water cooler, listening to him describe challenges he had never faced and solutions he had never developed. When one of the marketing guys asked about the research methodology, David launched into a detailed explanation of my interview process as if he had personally conducted every conversation. The ease with which he claimed ownership of my work was terrifying. It suggested a level of premeditation that made me question everything about our partnership. That evening, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of confronting David directly, I would speak to Janet about the project's true development process. She had been supportive throughout the initiative, and I believed she would want to know the full story. I scheduled a meeting under the pretense of discussing implementation details, but my real goal was to gently correct the record. When I sat across from her in her office, surrounded by motivational posters and family photos, I felt a surge of confidence. "Janet, I wanted to talk to you about the project timeline and my role in developing the core methodologies," I began. But something in her expression stopped me cold. She looked at me with a kind of polite confusion, as if I were claiming credit for something that was obviously beyond my capabilities. "Sarah, I think David did an excellent job leading that initiative," she said carefully. "And I'm sure your support was valuable to him." Support. The word hit me like a physical blow. Somehow, in the span of 24 hours, I had been demoted from project leader to support staff in the official company narrative. When I tried to explain my actual contributions, Janet's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable, as if I were being unprofessional or petty. The following week brought a series of small humiliations that confirmed my worst fears. I received an email from the company newsletter requesting a quote about working with David on his successful project. The casual assumption that I had been merely a team member rather than the architect of the initiative was breathtaking. When I didn't respond immediately, they sent a follow-up email suggesting I could share what I had learned from David's leadership approach. I stared at that email for 20 minutes, my hands shaking with frustration. Everything about the situation felt surreal, like I was living in some kind of alternate reality, where my months of work had been retroactively assigned to someone else. Even more disturbing was the realization that David must have actively reinforced this narrative in conversations I wasn't part of. He wasn't just passively accepting undeserved credit. He was actively cultivating a false version of events that positioned him as the visionary leader, and me as his grateful subordinate. The final nail in the coffin came during our regular team meeting the following Friday. Janet announced that David would be taking on additional responsibilities, including oversight of the project's implementation phase. Given his excellent work on the system redesign, she said, beaming at him with obvious pride, we're expanding David's role to include strategic planning for our other operational improvements. I felt the room spinning around me as I realized what was happening. Not only had David stolen credit for my work, but he was now being rewarded for that theft with promotions and opportunities that should have been mine. The other team members nodded approvingly, some even offering congratulations. They had all bought into the revised history that positioned David as the brilliant strategist who had single-handedly revolutionized our processes. When Janet asked if there were any questions, I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could I say? How could I object without sounding bitter and unprofessional? The trap had been set so perfectly that any attempt to escape would only make me look worse. That weekend, I sat in my apartment, staring at the copies of all my project documentation, the interviews, the analysis, the methodology I had developed from scratch. The evidence of my work was undeniable, but somehow it had become irrelevant. David had managed to claim ownership not just of the final product, but of the entire creative process that had produced it. The most painful part was realizing how perfectly he had manipulated the situation. By positioning himself as the communicator and me as the technical support, he had created a narrative that felt plausible to everyone except me. My detailed knowledge of the project's development could be explained away as the natural result of working closely with the real leader. My emotional investment could be dismissed as the enthusiasm of a dedicated team member. Every genuine contribution I had made had been recontextualized as evidence of David's effective leadership, rather than my own initiative and expertise. The betrayal was complete, but it was also invisible. To everyone else in the company, David was a rising star who had successfully led a major initiative. I was simply another employee who had been lucky enough to be part of his team. The silence that followed his theft wasn't just the absence of acknowledgement. It was the presence of a new reality where my version of events had been systematically erased. As I prepared for another week of pretending everything was normal, I realized that David's betrayal had been perfect in its execution. He had stolen my work, my recognition, and my future opportunities while maintaining the appearance of being a collaborative leader. And the most devastating part was that he had done it all with a smile, treating me like a valued colleague, even as he systematically dismantled my professional reputation. The trust I had placed in him hadn't just been misplaced, it had been weaponized against me with surgical precision. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was relentless. Like watching a photograph fade in sunlight, my presence in the company began to blur and diminish with each passing day. It started with the small things. Meetings I wasn't invited to, emails I wasn't copied on, decisions that were made without my input. At first, I attributed these oversights to the usual chaos of office life. People forget to hit reply all. Meetings get scheduled hastily, and sometimes wires get crossed. But as the pattern continued and intensified, I began to understand that this wasn't about forgetfulness or poor communication. This was about systematic exclusion, a deliberate effort to push me to the margins of an organization where I had once been central. The cruelest part was how gradually it happened. If they had simply announced that I was being demoted or transferred, I could have fought back or at least understood what was happening. Instead, I was slowly suffocated by 1,000 small exclusions, each one plausibly deniable but collectively devastating. The first major incident happened 3 weeks after David's presentation. I arrived at work on a Tuesday morning to find my computer access to the project files had been revoked. When I called IT to report what I assumed was a technical glitch, the support technician put me on hold for several minutes before returning with an explanation that made my blood run cold. It looks like David requested that access be transferred to his team only. The technician said in that matter-of-fact tone that tech support people use when they're delivering bad news. He said the project was moving into a new phase, and the old team structure was being reorganized. His team. The project that I had conceived, researched, and developed had become David's team, and I was no longer part of it. When I tried to explain that there had been some kind of mistake, the technician politely but firmly explained that he couldn't override a direct request from the project leader. Project leader. The title that should have been mine was now officially David's, and with it came the power to erase me from the initiative I had created. The exclusions spread like a virus through every aspect of my work life. Client meetings that I had been attending for months suddenly proceeded without me, and when I asked Janet about the schedule change, she looked genuinely confused. "Oh, David is handling the client relations now," she said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He felt it would be more efficient to have a single point of contact. More efficient. The phrase became a catch-all justification for my disappearing responsibilities. It was more efficient for David to handle the implementation meetings. More efficient for him to present updates to the executive team. More efficient for him to manage the vendor relationships that I had spent months cultivating. Each time, the explanation seemed reasonable on its surface, but the cumulative effect was to strip away every meaningful aspect of my job. I found myself spending entire days answering emails about minor administrative issues, while the work I had built my career around was redistributed to others. The social isolation was perhaps even more painful than the professional exclusion. The lunch invitations stopped coming. Colleagues who had once sought my advice on complex problems began directing those questions to David instead. Even casual conversations became strained and awkward, as if people weren't quite sure how to interact with someone whose status had become unclear. I remember standing in line at the cafeteria one Thursday, overhearing 2 colleagues discuss a strategic decision that directly related to my area of expertise. When I tried to join the conversation, offering insights based on my experience, they listened politely but then continued talking as if I hadn't spoken. It was a subtle but unmistakable message. My opinions were no longer valued, my expertise was no longer relevant, and my presence was becoming increasingly unnecessary. The casual cruelty of these interactions was devastating because it was so difficult to address directly. How do you complain about people being polite but dismissive? How do you report that you're being treated like a ghost when everyone maintains a facade of professional courtesy? The breaking point came during what should have been a routine quarterly review. I had prepared extensively, documenting my contributions to various projects and outlining my goals for the coming months. But when I sat down with Janet in her office, the conversation took a direction I hadn't anticipated. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about your role here and how we can better utilize your skills," she began, and immediately I knew this wasn't going to be the performance evaluation I had expected. She spoke about restructuring opportunities and finding the right fit for my talents, using the kind of careful corporate language that managers employ when they're preparing to deliver bad news. When I mentioned my work on the system redesign project, Janet's expression became uncomfortable. "Well, that project is really David's area now," she said. "But I'm sure there are other ways you can contribute to the team." Other ways. The phrase felt like a death sentence for my career aspirations. I was being repositioned from a strategic contributor to someone who needed to find other ways to be useful. The final insult came in the form of a company-wide email celebrating the success of David's innovative project and announcing its expansion to other departments. I read that email 3 times, sitting at my desk in stunned silence, as my colleagues around me discussed how impressive David's achievement was. The project that had consumed my life for months, that had kept me up at night and filled my weekends, was being celebrated as someone else's triumph. Worse, the email included quotes from executives praising David's visionary leadership and collaborative approach. Collaborative. The word felt like mockery, given that the most important collaborator had been systematically erased from the narrative. As I watched David accept congratulations from colleagues throughout the day, I realized that the theft was now complete. He hadn't just stolen my work, he had stolen my professional identity and my future at the company. Every opportunity that should have come from the project's success would now flow to him, while I was left to find other ways to contribute. That evening, I sat in my car in the office parking lot, watching the lights go out in the building where I had once felt so valued and essential. The transformation from trusted team member to irrelevant bystander had been so skillfully executed that I couldn't even pinpoint exactly when it had happened. It was like being slowly poisoned. Each day I felt a little weaker, a little more isolated, a little less important. But the change was so gradual that I couldn't identify the moment when my professional life had become terminal. David's car was still in the parking lot, and I could see the light on in what used to be our shared project space. He was probably working late, planning the next phase of the initiative I had created, surrounded by the documentation I had produced and the relationships I had built. The person who had once been my partner had become my replacement, and he had accomplished this transformation without ever openly acknowledging that it was happening. As I finally started my car and drove home through the darkened suburbs, I realized that tomorrow would bring more of the same, more exclusion disguised as efficiency, more isolation wrapped in corporate politeness, and more evidence that I was no longer welcome in the professional life I had worked so hard to build. The email arrived at 9:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, tucked between routine messages about office supplies and weekend maintenance schedules. Please see me in conference room B at 10 a.m. today. Thanks, Janet. The casual tone should have been reassuring, but something about the timing and formality of the request made my stomach clench with anxiety. Conference room B was the smaller meeting space, the one they used for private conversations and sensitive discussions. I spent the next 43 minutes trying to focus on my diminished workload, while my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe they were finally ready to address the project situation. Maybe Janet had realized the injustice of what had happened and wanted to make things right. Or maybe, a darker voice whispered in the back of my mind, this was something else entirely. I printed out copies of my recent work, organized my project documentation, and rehearsed what I would say if given the opportunity to defend my contributions. Looking back, I realized I was preparing for the wrong conversation entirely. When I walked into conference room B at exactly 10 a.m., Janet was already seated at the small round table, accompanied by Rebecca from Human Resources. The presence of HR should have been my first clue, but I was still operating under the assumption that this was a performance discussion or project review. Rebecca had a manila folder in front of her, and that practiced neutral expression that HR professionals perfect over years of delivering difficult news. Janet looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her pen and avoiding direct eye contact. Sarah, thank you for coming, she began, and immediately I knew that everything I had prepared to say was going to be irrelevant. The tone was too formal, too careful, too final. We need to discuss some changes in your role here at the company. Changes. Such a soft word to describe what was about to happen to my life. I sat down slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I placed my documentation on the table. The room felt smaller than usual. The air conditioning seemed too loud, and I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence that followed Janet's opening words. Rebecca took over the conversation with the kind of professional detachment that comes from years of practice. Sarah, due to organizational restructuring and budget considerations, we're going to have to eliminate your position effective immediately. Eliminate my position. Not reassign me. Not transfer me to another department. Not offer me a different role within the company. Eliminate. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything I had worked for. This decision wasn't made lightly. Rebecca continued, sliding a packet of papers across the table toward me. But we need to streamline our operations and focus on our core competencies. Core competencies. I almost laughed at the irony. The project that had demonstrated my core competencies more clearly than anything else in my career had somehow led to my elimination rather than my promotion. As Rebecca explained the details of my severance package and the timeline for clearing out my desk, I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. This couldn't be happening to me, not after everything I had contributed, not after all the late nights and weekend work and innovative solutions I had provided. The meeting lasted exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes to dismantle a career that had taken years to build. When Rebecca finished her explanation of benefits and procedures, she asked if I had any questions. I opened my mouth to ask about the timing, about whether this was related to the project situation, about why they were eliminating a position that had been so essential just months earlier. But the words wouldn't come. What was the point of asking questions when the decision had already been made? What was the point of defending my value when they had already decided I had none? Instead, I simply nodded and signed the papers that legally bound me to accept this version of reality. "We'll need you to pack up your personal belongings today," Janet said quietly. "Security will escort you out once you're finished." Security? As if I were a criminal rather than someone who had dedicated years of my life to the company's success. The transformation from valued employee to security risk had taken less than 20 minutes. The walk back to my cubicle felt like a funeral procession. Word travels fast in small offices, and I could sense the uncomfortable awareness rippling through the workspace as people realized what was happening. Some colleagues offered sympathetic looks. Others busied themselves with their computers to avoid having to acknowledge the situation. The hardest part was packing up the remnants of the project I had built. The notebooks filled with my research, the printed emails documenting my discoveries, the thank you notes from employees I had interviewed. Each item felt like evidence of a crime that would never be prosecuted, proof of contributions that would never be recognized. As I placed my personal photos and coffee mug into a cardboard box, I noticed David's office door was closed. He had made himself conveniently unavailable for what should have been an awkward encounter. Even at the end, he was managing the situation to avoid any uncomfortable conversations or explanations. The security escort was a young man named Marcus, who clearly felt as uncomfortable with the situation as I did. "I'm sorry about this," he said quietly as we walked toward the exit. "I know you've been here a long time." His kindness almost broke my composure. Yes, I had been there a long time. Long enough to believe that loyalty and hard work mattered. Long enough to trust that contributions would be recognized and rewarded. Long enough to think that I was building something permanent rather than something that could be taken away with 17 minutes of corporate speak and a manila folder full of legal documents. As we reached the front door, I turned back to look at the office one last time. Through the glass walls, I could see people already returning to their normal routines. The disruption of my departure absorbed into the rhythm of business as usual. David's office light was on now, and I could see him at his desk, probably planning the next phase of the project I would never see completed. The parking lot felt surreal in the midday sun. Other people were going about their normal Wednesday activities, running errands, meeting friends for lunch, living lives that hadn't been appended by manila folders and eliminated positions. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the building where I had spent so many hours, believing I was building something meaningful. The cardboard box on my passenger seat contained the physical remnants of my career, but it couldn't hold the real loss, the sense of purpose, the professional identity, the belief that competence and dedication would be enough to secure a future. As I finally started the engine and drove away from the office for the last time, I realized that the betrayal was complete. David hadn't just stolen my project and my recognition. He had created the conditions that made my elimination possible. By positioning himself as the indispensable leader and me as redundant support staff, he had made my departure seem logical and necessary. The masterpiece of his deception was that he had convinced everyone, including the people who fired me, that my absence would barely be noticed. The cruelest irony was that he was probably right. The first week of unemployment felt like living in someone else's life. I would wake up at 6:30 a.m. out of habit, my body still programmed for a routine that no longer existed, and lie there in the grey morning light trying to remember why I didn't need to get dressed for work. The silence in my apartment was deafening. No alarm clock urgency, no shower rushing, no coffee gulped while checking emails on my phone. Instead, there was just this vast emptiness where my professional purpose used to be. I tried to establish new routines, but everything felt artificial and forced. Making breakfast became an elaborate process because I had nowhere to be and nothing urgent to accomplish. I would sit at my kitchen table, stirring my coffee long after the sugar had dissolved, staring out the window at neighbors who were heading off to jobs they still had, lives they still recognized. The taste of everything seemed muted, as if my ability to experience pleasure had been connected to my sense of professional worth and had died along with my career. Those early days were haunted by phantom responsibilities. I would catch myself mentally preparing for meetings that weren't on my calendar, worrying about deadlines that were no longer mine to meet, and composing emails in my head to colleagues who had already forgotten I existed. My laptop sat closed on the dining room table like an artifact from another life, and I couldn't bring myself to open it for weeks. When I finally did, the lack of work emails felt like walking into an abandoned house where all the furniture had been covered with sheets. My professional social media profiles seemed like memorials to someone who had died suddenly, the last posts filled with enthusiasm about projects that had been completed by other people, connections with colleagues who had moved on without looking back. The hardest part was the absence of anyone asking how I was doing or checking if I needed anything. In the corporate world, I had been surrounded by people all day, every day. Now, entire days would pass without a single work-related conversation, and the silence felt like being buried alive. The practical aspects of unemployment were almost easier to handle than the emotional devastation. Filing for benefits, updating my resume, and beginning the job search gave me concrete tasks that temporarily distracted me from the larger questions about what had gone wrong and why. But even these routine activities became reminders of how completely my professional identity had been dismantled. When unemployment office clerks asked about the reason for my job loss, I struggled to explain the situation without sounding bitter or paranoid. Position eliminated due to restructuring was the official explanation, but it felt like a lie that protected everyone except me. How could I tell strangers about David's systematic theft of my work without appearing to blame others for my failure? How could I describe the months of being marginalized without seeming like someone who couldn't handle office politics? The narrative of my unemployment became another form of isolation, forcing me to accept a version of events that erased the injustice I had experienced. 3 weeks into my forced exile, I ran into Jennifer from HR at the grocery store. She was the same person who had been acknowledged during David's presentation for her minimal contributions to the project. The encounter happened in the produce section, both of us reaching for the same bag of apples, and for a moment we just stared at each other with the kind of awkward recognition that happens when different worlds collide unexpectedly. "Sarah, how are you doing?" she asked with that overly bright tone people use when they're not sure if they should acknowledge an uncomfortable situation. I mumbled something about keeping busy and looking for new opportunities, but she seemed genuinely concerned. "I heard about what happened with your position," she said, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "It seemed really sudden. I hope you land on your feet." The kindness in her voice almost broke my composure. Here was someone who had witnessed David's theft firsthand, who knew how little she had actually contributed compared to my months of work, and she was the first person to acknowledge that something about my departure hadn't made sense. The conversation with Jennifer planted a seed of validation that I desperately needed. For weeks, I had been questioning my own memory and perception, wondering if I had somehow misunderstood the situation or overestimated my contributions. The gaslighting had been so complete that I had started to doubt my own version of events. But Jennifer's reaction confirmed that my dismissal had seemed abrupt and inexplicable. to at least one person who had observed the situation from the inside. That night, I called my sister Lisa, who lived 3 states away and worked in a completely different industry. I told her the whole story for the first time. The project development, David's gradual appropriation of my work, the presentation where I was erased, and the systematic exclusion that followed. Lisa listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That's not normal workplace politics, Sarah," she finally said. "That's deliberate sabotage. And the fact that they fired you right after proves that David knew exactly what he was doing." Her words were like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating in a room full of corporate doublespeak and polite dismissals. The worst part of those early weeks wasn't the financial stress or the uncertainty about my future career. It was the way the experience had poisoned my relationship with work itself. I found myself unable to feel excited about job listings or potential opportunities because I couldn't shake the fear that any new workplace would contain its own version of David, waiting to exploit my trust and steal my contributions. The lesson I had learned was that competence and dedication weren't protection against betrayal. They might actually make you a more attractive target for people who understood how to manipulate collaborative relationships. When I forced myself to attend networking events and job interviews, I felt like I was wearing a mask of professional enthusiasm that barely concealed my underlying terror of being vulnerable again. Every handshake felt potentially dangerous. Every friendly colleague could be a future betrayer. And every exciting project might become another opportunity for someone else to build their career on my stolen work. But slowly, very slowly, something else began to emerge from the wreckage of my professional confidence. It started with small moments of clarity, like realizing that I could describe my project methodology with authority and precision, because it had genuinely been my creation, or remembering the satisfaction I had felt when employees thanked me for finally addressing problems they had been dealing with for years. The theft of credit couldn't erase the actual knowledge I had gained, or the skills I had developed during those months of intensive work. David could claim ownership of my contributions, but he couldn't actually possess the experience and expertise that had made those contributions possible. As the weeks passed and the immediate shock began to fade, I started to understand that while I had lost a job and been denied recognition, I hadn't lost my essential professional capabilities. The project had been stolen, but the person who created it was still intact, scarred but not destroyed. And that person, wounded, wiser, and infinitely more cautious about trust, was slowly beginning to plan her next move. 2 years have passed since that Wednesday morning in Conference Room B, and I rarely talk about what happened at my old company. Not because I'm ashamed or embarrassed, but because I've learned that some experiences are so deeply transformative that they resist casual conversation. The betrayal I experienced became a masterclass in human nature and workplace dynamics that no business school could have provided. When people ask why I left my previous position, I give them the standard corporate answer about seeking new challenges and growth opportunities. But the real truth is that I didn't leave. I was surgically removed after being systematically discredited by someone I had trusted completely. That distinction matters to me, even if it doesn't matter to anyone else. The scars from that experience have become my most valuable professional assets, teaching me lessons that I carry into every workplace interaction, like protective armor that's invisible but absolutely essential. The first and most important boundary I established was around the ownership of my work and ideas. Never again would I allow someone else to present my contributions without explicit, documented acknowledgement of my role. In my new position at a consulting firm downtown, I make sure that every email I send includes clear attribution for ideas and analysis. When I collaborate on projects, I insist on written agreements about who will present which sections and how contributions will be acknowledged. My colleagues probably think I'm overly concerned with credit and recognition, but I've learned that professional survival requires vigilance about these details. The casual trust I once extended so freely has been replaced by a more strategic approach to collaboration. I document everything, copy multiple people on important communications, and never rely on verbal agreements about sharing credit or responsibilities. Some might call this cynical, but I call it educated. I've seen what happens when good faith and hard work collide with calculated manipulation, and I refuse to be that vulnerable ever again. The second lesson carved itself into my consciousness through months of painful reflection. I will never again mistake someone's charm and communication skills for leadership or competence. David had been masterful at creating the impression of collaborative partnership while systematically positioning himself as the primary contributor to our shared work. His easy confidence and articulate presentation style had convinced me that he was genuinely committed to shared success, when in reality he was executing a carefully planned campaign to claim ownership of my contributions. Now, when I encounter colleagues who seem too smooth, too eager to be the public face of collaborative efforts, I pay attention to the gap between their rhetoric and their actual contributions. I've learned to value substance over style, documented work over persuasive conversation, and consistent behavior over charming performance. The most dangerous people in professional environments aren't the obviously aggressive competitors. They're the ones who smile while they undermine you, who frame exploitation as collaboration, and who make you grateful for the opportunity to be robbed. Perhaps the most fundamental change in my professional approach is that I no longer seek validation or recognition from supervisors and colleagues as my primary source of job satisfaction. The desperate need for external approval had made me vulnerable to David's manipulation because I was so hungry for acknowledgement that I overlooked clear warning signs about his intentions. Now, I derive my sense of professional worth from the quality of my work itself, the problems I solve, the value I create, regardless of whether others properly attribute that value to me. This shift has been liberating in ways I couldn't have anticipated. When I know that I've done excellent work, I don't need anyone else to confirm that knowledge. When I've contributed to a successful outcome, I don't require public praise to feel satisfied with my role. This internal locus of evaluation has made me much harder to manipulate, because I'm no longer dependent on others for my sense of professional identity and worth. The fourth boundary I've established is around the information I share and the access I provide to my work processes. In my previous role, I had been completely transparent with David about my methodology, my sources, and my analytical approaches. I shared everything freely because I believed we were genuine partners working toward a common goal. That openness became the weapon he used against me, allowing him to claim intimate knowledge of work he had never actually performed. Now, I collaborate more strategically, sharing finished products and specific contributions while maintaining closer control over my proprietary methods and approaches. I've learned that there's a difference between being a team player and being naive about intellectual property. When colleagues ask detailed questions about how I develop certain insights or achieve particular results, I provide helpful guidance without giving away the complete blueprint that took me years to develop. This isn't about being secretive or uncooperative. It's about protecting the competitive advantages I've earned through experience and hard work. The fifth lesson emerged from watching how quickly the narrative of my contributions was rewritten and accepted by people who should have known better. I've learned that most people in workplace environments are far more interested in convenient stories than complicated truths. David's version of events was easier for everyone to accept because it didn't require them to confront uncomfortable questions about fairness, recognition, or their own complicity in allowing talented people to be exploited. Now, I don't expect colleagues or supervisors to be advocates for justice or fairness unless they have clear incentives to do so. I protect my own interests because I've learned that very few people will protect them for me. This doesn't mean I've become cynical about all workplace relationships, but I've become much more realistic about the limitations of those relationships and the conditions under which they can be trusted. The final and most important boundary is perhaps the hardest to maintain. I refuse to let the betrayal I experienced poison my ability to do meaningful work or find satisfaction in professional challenges. It would be easy to become so defensive and guarded that I never fully engage with projects or colleagues again. But that would mean letting David's theft extend beyond my previous job to contaminate my entire career. Instead, I've learned to channel the lessons from that experience into better judgment and stronger boundaries, while maintaining my capacity for innovation, collaboration, and genuine professional excellence. The betrayal taught me to be more careful, but it didn't teach me to be less capable. In my current role, I'm known for producing exceptional work while maintaining clear professional boundaries. My colleagues respect my competence and my integrity, and I've built a reputation based on documented results rather than borrowed glory. The most satisfying part of my professional recovery is knowing that I've become a better, stronger, and more strategic professional because of what I survived. David may have stolen my project and my recognition, but he couldn't steal my ability to learn, grow, and ultimately thrive in spite of his betrayal. That knowledge, more than any external validation, gives me the confidence to continue building a career that no one can take away from me.